I want you to go on to picture the enlightenment or ignorance of our human condition as follows. Imagine an underground chamber like a cave, with a long entrance open to the daylight and as wide as the cave. In this chamber are men who have been prisoners there since they were children, their legs and necks being so fastened that they can only look straight ahead of them and cannot turn their heads. Some way off, behind and high up, a fire is burning, and between the fire and the prisoners and above them runs a road, in front of which a curtain wall has been built, like the screen at puppet shows, between the operators and their audience, above which they show their puppets. I see. Imagine further that there are men carrying all sorts of gear along behind the curtain wall, projecting above it, and including figures of men and animals made of wood and stone and all sorts of materials, and that some of these men, as you would expect, are talking and some not. An odd picture and an odd sort of prisoner. They are drawn from life. For tell me, do you think our prisoners could see anything of themselves or their fellows except the shadows thrown by the fire on the wall of the cave opposite them? How could they see anything else if they were prevented from moving their heads all their lives? And would they see anything more of the objects carried along the road? Of course not. Then if they were able to talk to each other, would they not assume that the shadows they saw were real things? Inevitably.
Re-ask your question, Lizelle. I'm so excited. I love Plato so much.
Not a sudden I can't speak anymore. You know how shy I am, Robert.
But I don't think this question is being directed to me. Let's just make that clear.
Okay. Yes. So when I read the cave story again, I was a bit like two things popped in mind. How is this not the hermeneutics of suspicion? And maybe the two worlds mythology. Because I know those are two things that John is very much against. And I know he's very pro the cave story. So, but when I read it, maybe superficially, I see both those things in here. So how is it not that?
All right. Without answering the question, I want to ask you to clarify, what is it that seems to you to indicate the hermeneutics of suspicion on the one hand?
Yes.
And like the other question about the two worlds thing, just because he's talking about the difference between, let's just say, sense perception and dialectic reasoning, all that abstraction and whatnot, that doesn't automatically entail some kind of metaphysics, although there is some discussion of the forms being more real than the objects that participate in them. But I don't know if that necessarily entails a two worlds thing in the way that John uses the two worlds thing. But I mean, that's easier to see. I don't see the hermeneutics of suspicion. So what makes you say that?
Well, it's the matrix thing, right? It's like we're caught in a unreal reality, and we're being fooled, probably because someone is carrying the images that's making the shadows.
Oh.
And John always says, well, you can't say go with hermeneutic. You can't say this is not real unless there's something real. But Plato does say there is something real. So then it does feel a bit like a hermeneutics of suspicion, like.
Well, I think the analogy is being used, the cave analogy is being used not in a suspicious, in a hermeneutics of suspicion, but to just bring out through analogical reasoning, the greater and lesser degrees of knowledge and truth. That's the way I would look at it. And it's a love of the true and the good and the beautiful, which Plato is trying to direct your attention to in a way in which you're not being fooled. It's against a kind of being fooled by your appearances. That would be an attempt to defend Plato.
But but the myth starts with the people being fooled. And he says explicitly, at least in my Dutch version, this story is about us. We are the people who are seeing the shadows only.
Right. So look, if you think that there's a way of cognition that's inaccurate, like you said, there must be a way that is accurate. Otherwise, there's no contrast. Everything can't be tall, right? That doesn't imply that there's a like. I don't think it implies the hermeneutics of suspicion. I think it's to orient attention to a wiser form of cognition. That's the way I would put it if I was to defend Plato against that charge. And like I say, yeah, even though the analogy is about us, it's an analogy like the Matrix is a kind of analogy. It doesn't mean that we're literally in a matrix, but it's and of course that seems like some people, after they see the Matrix, they become cynical and suspicious and say, oh, we never know anything. How do we know? But Plato's not encouraging that at all. He's saying there's something that's very real. It's like, okay, you think it's a snake, but it's just a rope. It's a rope. Don't think of it as a snake. That's in the Hindu analogy between reality and illusion. And it's not the idea that everything is an illusion. No, it can't be, like John says. The concept of illusion implies a non-illusion. It doesn't make sense otherwise. But the two worlds thing is a little harder to defend against, because most people do interpret the line and the cave, above the line. Well, it depends on which way you structure the line, but one side of the line is metaphysics and the other side is epistemology. So, and on the two different sides of the lower and the higher, the visible versus the invisible, intelligible, that does seem, those are metaphysical distinctions, right? So, but just because you can make the distinction and say, oh, let's just say, look, here's an object and here's its reflection in the water, and here's a picture of it, which is at a further remove. So the furthest the remove, the less real it is, doesn't mean that you're dividing the world into this two worlds thing and saying, oh, only the one world is the good one. We should only live in there, etc. Because Plato says you need to go back into the cave. And
if you bring in the lines, then it makes a much more sense. Because I recently heard John talk about there's not like only two polars. There's like in between. There's something moving in between them, and that the line brings that out, which is missing from if you only read the cave. But if you also read about the line, you get that moving up and moving down, emergence and eminence idea.
Right, ascension and turn.
Let's talk about that for a second, because there could be a monological view of the world, or there could be a dialogical view. And if you need not only a cave but a sun and a line, that's evidence for a more dialogical worldview, which is kind of interesting. And then if you start to kind of play with that dialectic of those three things, like you're saying, Lizelle, if you just have the cave, you have illusion, but then if you have the cave and the sun and the line, you have actually like illusion, the good and change, or something like that. So it's really an important point to actually see that, like, oh, I need something beyond what I'm cognating about, this cave that we're wondering about. I need more than that to actually understand the fullness of even the cave that I'm looking at. Like it forces the participant in the analogy or in the story to look beyond the story itself in a lot of different ways, which I find really cool about the cave in particular.
Yeah. You know what else I'm thinking? Shadow. I'm not really good at, you can see a shadow going over my face, right? But if we were in a room at night and I put my hand up with the flashlight, you'd see that big hand on the wall, right? The shadow. But if you didn't see my hand and you only saw the shadow on the wall, through proper reasoning, you might be able to infer that there was an object casting the shadow. right? And that the shadow is less real than the hand, and so on, right? So what Plato's trying to do is get people who are stuck in the world of things that are less real and get them to reason their way through dialectic to arrive at things that are more real. And this is an enlightenment process.
But if
Yeah.
you've been tied your whole life by your neck and your hands and your feet and everything, and you've only seen shadows your whole life, how on earth are you going to deduce that there's a hand actually throwing that shadow if shadows are all you know? Because that's
Right.
the situation that the people find themselves in.
Right. Well, that's why in the analogy, one of them is, released and turned around, and education is turning the soul around. And what is the method? It's dialectic, right? So we have a world of appearances only, which is sense perception. And I think of the criticism of empiricism from the rationalists, Plato's a rationalist, who say that the senses are dumb because a cow can perceive everything that we're perceiving, sense perception, right? Without reason to interpret, oh, that's a hand, and it's separate from the thing behind it. Look, because when it moves, the thing behind it is not moving. And, so you use dialectic to figure things out, right? And that's reason that's going on in the case. So this is his model for education, that we have to use dialectic to turn minds away from all they know is the shadows. And when he talks about in book 7, what are some things that challenge the mind? Certain things do and certain things don't, right? And he thought math, right? Even just the concept of one. What's a one? The thing with the fingers. Remember, I don't know if you read it recently, but he talked the thing about what's a one and what's not a one, and how all fingers are ones. But yeah. So these mathematical concepts trigger the mind out of being hypnotized by appearances only.
Oh, yeah.
If you're not challenged, you're stuck in the world like the cave. You're just looking at the shadows, right? And you're not noticing what's deeper, which are the similarities and differences between things that matter philosophically. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
That help?
That helped. That helped. This helped.
That's why
yeah.
math is the second highest virtue, because it takes concentration. And if you're building concentration, but you're a bad person, and then you find the good, you've got more concentration to appreciate the good. So if you're always, as a teacher, helping people get better concentration, even if they're not getting good, that's helping them. That's why I think math is so divine in the Pythagorean Platonic corpus, because imagine two people, like two farmers, and one concentrates twice a day on math and one doesn't. That concentration is going to be awesome in that abstract reasoner that's using their imagination and their mind so often. I love that idea.
This might be a kind of off or unexpected or a weird reference, but one of Ayn Rand's followers, Leonard Peikoff, was one of her main students, wrote a book about her epistemology. I forget what it's called, but I'll look it up and I'll put it in the link. He has a whole chapter, more than one chapter, about how she does this whole thing with what the concept of a unit is. It's a kind of thing that forms a one, right? And like all concepts have some kind of unit thing going on in them. They're different units, but they're all units. And if you have to have the concept of what a unit is to know anything else. It's a fascinating analysis, but it's like she really dives deeply into this little passage that Plato was just talking about how the concept of a one, just the concept of what it means to be a one, how rich that is conceptually and philosophically. She derives her entire philosophy, her metaphysics and epistemology from that. It's fascinating. You might disagree with her political philosophy. She's a tremendous polemicist against collectivism and all that, but that's independent of this. Her epistemology about units and types of things, concepts and what concept formation, how concepts are differentiated and what's alike and what's unalike, and mathematics comes all conceptual knowledge and mathematical knowledge are rooted in the concept of a one. It's a brilliant analysis that she has. I'm going to find it and send it to you.
Yeah, that's Proclus and like Iamblichus and Porphyry. Porphyry was a great logician of his time. And genus and species. I know if John was here, John could probably educate us on like the difference between a genus and a species philosophically. It's such an important idea because the concept has to be a unity, right? Like how can an idea of a man or a woman or a number like one or two not be a unit? So then you can have a whole dialectic with it, right? Because how can it relate to not being there? What if the number one didn't exist in reality? Like you could have that whole dialectic and wonder about that for quite a while if you wanted to. And then you could wonder of like, what if the number one was coming to be in reality and wonder about, because concepts come to be, right? Like theories of evolution come to be, they are not, they come to be, they are, and they have relationships with all other beings at the same time if you believe in a dialectic kind of universe. So yeah, I find that so beautiful, Rick. I don't know if other people do, but I think that it's really profound.
The very note, to me, all knowledge, I mean, Ayn Rand says it all rests on the concept of a unit, and this is just maybe another way of slicing the same kind of dialectical kind of analysis of this zone of thinking from a different angle. But it's always struck me when you mentioned genus and species. To me, all knowledge rests on this distinction between like and unalike, or
Right.
same and different. This is different from the thing behind it. It's, and I could discern that because the thing behind it isn't moving while this is, right? So there's some kind of unit here, right? So, and things, there are other things that are like this, and that's unlike this, right? Like and unlike. If you can't differentiate, and John talks about this in Cog Sci, right? Differentiation and integration, right? All this kind of thing. And genus and species, genus is the way in which things share a larger category, and species is what differentiates things within that category. This is Aristotle's definition of definition, right? So what is a brother? The genus is sibling. That's the smallest conceptual category, the type of thing that a brother is. And what differentiates brothers from other things in the genus? Maleness. So a brother is a male sibling. Maleness is the species. Sibling is the genus. That's incredible that Aristotle, but Socrates was doing that dialectically without having the names genus and species. And Aristotle certainly learned that from Plato. And Plato doesn't name them, but he uses this reasoning all the time. What kind of thing is it? And how does it differ from other things? Is it this kind of thing? Is it that kind of thing? Right? Socrates does this in almost all the dialogues. But Plato was brilliant to formalize it as genus and species. And then, given that, like, oh, a cat is an animal, all animals are living things, therefore all cats are living. Logic came out of genus and species, all of logic. And the genus and species, it requires the concept of a unit, a one, a kind of thing. That's what a genus is. It's a kind of thing. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Complete side note, but Sevilla, didn't you just love that he mentioned at the end to remember that women can also do this?
Oh, yes.
That Socrates said, just remember, guys, we also said women can have these qualities that makes them like philosophers. I loved hearing that.
Well,
Yeah, Plato was one of the first feminists.
I mean, he talks about a faculty, this whole thing, there's, a lot of this is about that faculty we have to learn.
Yeah.
If learning isn't like one of the top, like the best virtue, it's one of the top ones. If you just commit to like a life of learning, you're going to go very far regardless of any other virtues you commit to. I think like, and if you hate learning, if you despise learning, like in your soul, your capacity to transcend your perspective is like so hard to do. It's a really powerful like meta virtue.
Well, you can certainly cut off that learning, that process, the instrument.
Most people stop learning after college, right? Like I remember I had multiple professors say, I like being even a junior college teacher because these are the last ideas going in most people's heads as they get older. It really is, because it's statistically people don't adopt new ideas as often out of college versus in. It's just.
I also love that, like for Socrates, you only graduate at 50. Then you're a graduate.
Yeah, when I was reading these ages that they were talking about, I was thinking about my own life and wondering how I fared, according to this standard. When I was younger, my memory was much better than it is now. And I remember thinking, oh boy, I don't know if I'm eligible to be a guardian because my memory is getting weaker as the years go by. But I think my memory getting what I'm calling weaker as the years go by is me realizing that fewer and fewer things are salient and relevant, and therefore I don't care and I just don't retain. I've kind of zeroed in on, like what Chris said, what's left over is the impact that things have on people when he was talking about the philosophy game in the pub, right? It's like, it's the process, it's the experience, it's not the content of it. And my orientation has shifted in that way over the decades.
And if you can get the process right, you can have a great life. In fact, that's what this whole exercise is. This, like teaching people, not just people who follow John Vervaeke, but teaching everyone that this process itself is what makes life worth living.
Yeah, and that's an argument in favor of Pierre Grimes's approach. Right? It's not the content that you've absorbed, which your credentials can verify. Check, check, check. And this is a debate within philosophical counseling, methodless or methods. And I'm a methodless person. But then the critique is, oh, you methodless people, what was it? Rajneesh, Bhagwan Rajneesh, aka Osho, and the Guru's Beetle. The Beatles guru, what was it? Maharishi Mahesh Yogi? They were debating once about method versus no method. And Osho is a no method, hippie-ish kind of guy. And the TM guy, the mantra, that's his method, TM, Transcendental Meditation. So the TM guy says to the no method guy, all you no method guys, you got to where you are through methods. But now that you're there, you don't think the methods are useful.
That's what I would say to you, because if method is equated with reason, you have so much experience and reasoning capacity that even despite not having like a method, you're bringing a lot of techne and expertise to bear on. So the idea of like techne versus no techne, you can't say that. We already talked about this earlier. Like no techne, a Platonist might call you a mollusk because you're just compelled to act on the physical animal level perpetually. But so you kind of need the merger of reason and love.
Yeah, that's the moral I take from Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
Yeah.
Osho, you practiced all those methods,
right?
Many years. That's why you're so skillful and you don't need the methods anymore. That's like, there's another metaphor in Indian philosophy. I think it was Ramakrishna, Vivekananda's guru, who said, yeah, you need the stick to stir the fire, but once it's going really well, you could throw the stick in, and you should, right? So the method, you need the method to get you. We need these psychotechnologies to change, to turn our attention from the shadows to the light, right? But once we've
can tell you're such a meditator, Rick, that you're just like, you need the method, but then as soon as you get to a place, drop the method. That's such a meditative explanation.
So we can make it part of the game, the card game. At a certain point, you throw the cards in the fire.
That's a great idea, because that will make people have to keep buying decks of cards.
Gathering the logs of the Logos, literally, by the end of this game, yeah.
You can make it part of the symbolic ritual. Burning the cards in the fire. The fire, if the logos get sparked, then you throw the cards in the fire, man.
See, every one of these could be a little like,
you might have to take that outside the pub to start the fire.
You need to make these videos, Rick, and then put them on TikTok and on, wherever people are. I would love to watch a philosopher burn a deck of cards after poeticizing on courage for 4 minutes and then having their friend poeticize on moderation or whatever they are, and then when they really get moderation they all take a shot or whatever it is.
At the end, everybody has to take a group shot and then go burn the cards outside.
Chris, you wanted to say something earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, what was it? I might have let it go. One of the
Okay.
one of the details I was thinking about in the cave myth is that one of the details that I find kind of interesting is that maybe it goes back to your initial question, Lizelle, about whether this is a hermeneutics of suspicion. And one of the things I find interesting is that I think he takes pains to say that the eyesight, like the actual capacity and the keenness of the eyesight of the person in the cave, is no less than the person who's ascended. And I think that makes it very, there's no agency or force that's actually keeping the prisoners in the cave, which is one of the things that makes it so different from the Gnostic myth. And a really significant detail for me. Now, I know it's odd that they start off as being prisoners, and so that's an odd thing. And the context of that I find a little bit unclear. But the fact that the fact that someone is initially released, or there's one person who can escape, apparently of their own capacity, is to me a really significant detail. And the fact that the person, if they apply the keenness of their capacity to learn to the shadows themselves, will find in those shadows things that are very real and very relevant. And that capacity is powerful, even in that state of confinement, you know. And that the thing that changes is just the direction of attention. Like, that's the only thing that changes. It's not as though the person gains a godlike capacity they didn't have at the beginning. It's not as there's very little dramatic that actually happens. The only thing that happens is they take everything that they already have to give and to use, and they just turn it. That's it.
Yeah.
That's
like
it.
Right.
And in some sense, that makes the whole thing far. It seems to me very undramatic, and that to me means that, you know, I find it helpful to think about that to take that myth and just put it all the way inside of a person, and to say, you know, the shadows, like when we're in this position where, let's say there's a complex that's running and it's creating all kinds of noise between the person and the fire, between the fire and the projection, and then we throw something on the world and we look at it and attend to it with such a keenness of detail that we'll find everything in it. We'll make so much ado of those shadows that we'll find an entire world in them, and there's going to be beauty and there's going to be power in that world. And all that it takes is something to find dissatisfaction in those shadows, and that's enough to begin the turn.
Or what Plato was talking about, confusion.
Yeah, aporia. That's the aporia, right? Is that my attention to the shadows taken so keenly has revealed some kind of inadequacy. There's something that's not accounted for, something dissatisfying. And that the very keenness of eyesight and the very keenness of the senses that find the shadows to be so absorbing is also the same keenness that can find them inadequate if it is tutored in the right way.
Right.
That there's nothing extra that need apply except for the tutoring to come to that realization, and that's it.
And this is similar to what John says, that the same processes that enlighten us can also bind us. I forget the terminology he uses for that.
Parasitic processing.
Yeah, yeah, the same processes can be what is the word? Can't think of the terminology I'm trying to go for. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy can be positive or negative, you know, it's the same mechanism.
Well, images in Plato are right before the good. Images are some of the strongest things in especially Neoplatonic philosophy. So the idea of like a desire as an image or a self-image or an image of the world and how those things all change. We were just talking about earlier how concepts have a unity to them. And so those unities can change, like the form of my memory of my mother can change over time. So I don't know, I think that's kind of interesting in this idea of like what it means to reckon with the good or to have the capacity to reason or wonder about things and how that can interact with like our images and ourself.
I do find the image of the cave, what happens, quite dramatic. Like they're being dragged up, forced to turn around, dragged up through pain when their eyes suddenly see. And I think he says explicitly, if they were told that what they saw weren't really real, they'll be dumbfounded and confused and like, what? And I do see a quite dramatic shift there. Like,
but Plato is using that as a metaphor. If you drag them, that would be the experience. But later on, he says the children shouldn't be forced. They should play, like you and your friends in the pub. They should play with this. Remember?
mm-hmm.
Well, that's the Tau erotica. That's what the Greeks would call like the seduction of the good. It's very hard to research this concept, but it's literally in the Republic in Greek. This idea of like TAU, like erotica, like the eros, seducing one towards something greater than oneself that is mysterious to oneself. And if it really is good, right, then it should fulfill that promise given in the seduction and the initial encounter, perhaps.
Chris, when you were talking about it being the exact same thing, another metaphor that I used in a different context with this idea of free will, whether or not you could have it in a deterministic or an indeterministic world. I make an argument in one of my writings about, think of lungs in two different kinds of atmospheres, one that has 100% oxygen and one that has 70% oxygen. The same lungs can be, you know, the same, but they might be able to breathe more in an atmosphere with 100%, right, than in one with 70%. And I make this analogy with a deterministic metaphysics versus an indeterministic one, and whether or not and how that would implicate free will. I think it's just like the lungs. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. The lungs stay the same. The abilities are the same, whether you're in a deterministic or indeterministic world. That's an argument that I make. So by analogy, you're talking about the same, we all have the latent skills or abilities, faculties for enlightenment or for delusion, and those don't change, right? And then that what also came to mind was in Zen, the state, I'm sure you've heard this, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So nothing changes except something shifted in your perspective. And it is dramatic on one level because it's like a Copernican revolution, right? Like, oh, I had everything backwards, right? But then, okay, all right, so but still all the same, right? So it's just like, it's almost like, okay, when you realize that the sun doesn't actually come up and go down, the earth spins around.
Right.
You still experience it as if it goes up and down. But at least if you understand the difference, so of course, in reality, enlightenment is a little bit more shocking, I would imagine, than just that realization. But it's something like that. It's got to be something that's radically new, like a Copernican revolution, a shift in perspective. But after you have it, it's like, okay, now we know that the sun isn't really moving.
and I think that the revelation of that, like the revelation is waking up to the world that is already and was already. And I don't think it's stepping into a new world. And I think that's where the two worlds mythology business, like I'm tempted to set that aside entirely, because I don't, like, I agree. I don't think any of this necessitates it, because the ingress into the new world is simply the awakening into it, right? It's the coming into consciousness, and that and so you're right. It's like there was a silly thing to say in some ways, to say it's undramatic. You're right. It's profoundly dramatic, but there's a beautiful tension between those two perspectives. There's a beautiful irony in that it's the most. It can occur without any change, any apparent change whatsoever on the face of a person. And yet the revolution that happens interiorly happens utterly and comprehensively. And everything is changed, but nothing's actually changed. Right? That everything that is coming into now, it's almost as though the relationship to being that has changed. And so the aspect of the world is different simply because the relationship is different. Just like a relationship with a person drops down into a new level, and suddenly they are a completely different person, even though they haven't changed at all.
What comes to me is that shift between an I-it relationship to an I-thou relationship.
Another thing that came to mind is the Buddha saying he just is awake. That's all. He went from kind of something dreamlike to something wake-like.
Have any of you ever heard layman tell the story where the Zen master has two students, his two students are meditating, they're in this deep sitting, and then they get up and like leave the room, and someone says to the master, like, what was they doing? He said, well, one of them was doing something very special, the other something very ordinary. It's like, I couldn't tell which one was doing which. And he's like, I could tell, but I'm not saying which one was which. And it's like, because it looks the same. That's what's so cool about Melissa Schilling is this cognitive scientist. She talks about insights and how they work. And it's really simple to kind of see how it works. It's an aha moment in a small world network, which is our being, is our mind or whatever. And so you see something and you could think they're totally different. Rick, do you think cats and dogs are the same or different? What do you think?
Yes, I would say yes, ironically.
Well, if you had to pick a side, I agree. That's
Not
the
the
most
same or
mature.
different. They're both.
That's the most mature. That's like meta perspectival. But like, if someone thought, is God in our world or in a second world, Rick? What do you think?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, if there is a God, I think it's in this world.
Okay. Well, what's God to you, and what's this world to you?
Well, you know, we're playing around with language.
I'm not.
Well, I am. Because this is the meaning of the term is, you know, conventionally defined by its use. Yeah. So, and this is a language game, as Wittgenstein would say. And there are many, many meanings of the term God,
Okay.
right? And I've got multiple possible meanings for this term hovering around in my usage of language.
Yeah.
So for me to pick just one of them is a little bit of a game, but
Rick is too smart. You should have asked me instead.
No, I'm cool with this because Rick implied that God was something that could be a possibility for many definitions for language, which I think is really cool. Does the world have that same characteristic?
Well, it depends on your understanding of those two terms. So the world, like for Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, is everything that is, right?
Okay.
And so on many understandings of God, God is everything that is. So this sounds
God
pantheism. It
Yeah.
sounds like kind of pantheism, and I'm not uncomfortable with that understanding. But that's not my only. I entertain lots of possibilities about. My attitude towards this is almost better captured by the Native Americans who say the great mystery, because as Protagoras, who was a sophist, he said one very brilliant thing, that the topic is too complex and life is too short for him to feel like he could make a confident assertion as an answer to that sort of question. That's how I feel about it.
Well, it's interesting, the relationship between definitions and mystery. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
One more thing. Despite my having had many noetic or Gnostic or mystical experiences that felt to me like I was in some kind of state, which is the zone of experience in where God is, so to speak, which is a sloppy way of putting it because there's no spatial metaphors for that.
It's a good way, I think,
love
to
it.
relating to, you know, taking into our hands various ways of naming this is very much like contending with the shadows on the wall. You know, it's like we have to remember that they are and are not. They share sameness and difference with the thing that casts them. And when taking them up, it's almost as though we have to take them up with a view to what casts them. And if we do that, we do it playfully. And if we do it playfully, then I think it helps a little bit with the hermeneutics of suspicion problem too, because, and it sort of gets back into Schindler a little bit, doesn't it? And he had this way of talking about this, which is that if we have this playful relationship to the things that we use to name that which is unnameable, then by taking them up into our hands, we develop a relationship with that which is beyond them, even though we're using them as the means of developing that relationship, right? And
oh, you'll love this, Christopher. This quote here. Let me read it to you. This is from oh, what's the gentleman's name? It's let me just find it real quick. It's right here. It's from, oh, what is that fellow's name? Oh, Gonzalez, the Dialectic and the Dialogue handbook. That's why I wanted to find it, because I knew some of you would know it at least. She says, dialectic focuses on the function of a word precisely in order to reveal the nature presupposed by this function. It abstracts from ends, I'll send this to you, external to words, and focuses on these words themselves. It is not concerned with using words to obtain something desired, or to communicate ideas, or even to point to sensible particulars. Words are not subordinated to some function accidental to them. So he's like, fuck you, Wittgenstein. That's what he's saying right there. But are allowed to serve and reveal their own function. In this way, dialectic counters a danger of everyday discourse. That is, that in it a word such as virtue can cease to serve its natural function. The word is uttered, but is no longer used to make manifest a specific nature. It is simply tossed back and forth between people who have a vague feeling that it means something positive. A possible consequence is that the word will even cease to serve the function of referring to a genuine cases of virtue. And then he keeps going on, but it's really cool what you were saying, and how when I was talking about the cave like a year and a half ago, that came up while we were doing this.
Yeah, please
There was
definitely
something.
send that.
Yeah, I'll send it for sure.
There was something in what you said, Chris, that almost, because I wanted to ask the question about what about bhakti yoga, like those who are inclined towards God in the way of love, of devotion. And what about them? From something you said, Rick, that made me feel like, was it the jnana yoga, that you only go intellectual? And so I was thinking, what about, but there was something what you said, Chris, that almost opened up that possibility of love towards God, even though we can only playfully name, or yeah, I kind of lost it, but I almost felt it when you were speaking. But yeah.
Can I back up a little, Robert? Why were you asking me those questions?
Well, because I was
Well,
trying to
and
talk about this
something, or did
woman,
we-
Melissa Schilling's research on insight and small world networks, and how cool it is when someone goes along with this thought experiment, that if you think two things are the same or different, you can actually reason through their features and come to the opposite conclusion. And it's an aha, it's an epiphany that creates. So I could say, oh, dogs and cats are different. And you say, well, they both have babies. They both have lactate. They both have 5 fingers and toes. They both have tails. And then they try to go, oh, they're both mammals. They are the same. And you can have an epiphany about 2 things that are completely not the same, and then come to an insight to where you go, oh no, actually they're a category that is the same.
So
You
cat and
chose a
dog,
really huge.
But yeah,
You
I didn't
chose a
want to
really
try and
huge
muster my intellect to try and do that with Rick, who actually has Gnostic and philosophical training. And it's like, well, where do you go from here? Yeah, he's
oh,
the
it's
perfect.
funny. When you asked me about God and world, I forgot that just a moment earlier you asked me about cat and dog. So I
Right, I was
lost
trying to do that. Yeah.
I lost the through line because that was such a bigger question, you know.
That's why Plato has them use anglers and simpler examples when they learn to reason and not God.
Pretty pots. That's why Plato or Socrates keeps talking about pretty pots,
Right.
right?
You know, they literally say, like, and let's use a non-controversial example to explore this theaetetus in the Sophist and in the Statesman and stuff.
But that was a very interesting path we went down. Like,
Yeah, I didn't expect Rick
yeah,
to say,
let's talk
well,
about God or nature. Like, yeah,
based on
let's do
my
that.
75 experiences with the mystical world, I could say that both are pretty paradoxically true at any moment. But it's cool, Christopher, how you're saying, like, just to recap a little bit, it's beautiful that in the Platonic tradition in particular, reasoning is inherent to to all of us. If you're part of the species of human and you have a self, then you can reason, and through like participation in nature, self transcend out of the cave of whatever might be sullying your character, or just the fact that like life is in flux and you have to move towards something because standing still is like dissipation or whatever. So it's really cool that in Plato there's no external force really besides the fact that the universe is itself good, or that being is good, if you don't like the particularity of the word universe or whatever.
What I hear you say, Robert, is the unexamined life is not worth living.
Unless you go at it 100%, and then I'm wondering about that, because if you just never examine, that is quite philosophical, I would say.
Well, yeah, this idea that we're all driven, I mean, I think that the idea is fairly clear in Plato, that we're all, that there's an appetite for the highest, for the most real. And that appetite can be that appetite prevails, but it can be distracted and distorted, and it can be taken off its course, and it can be misappropriated. We all have it in us, that the eros that desires and the eros that wants to love is primary, but that if it finds its object in something that's less real, it will take it for being real, and it will make it real, and it will envelop itself further into illusion. And that the education and the tutoring is the thing that differentiates those objects of reality from their lesser and greater forms, but that the instinct that actually drives us to relate to them, the instinct that's primary and that has us strive for it, remains. And now I don't, but that's also where Plato, I find there are limitations in Plato for that reason, because there are all kinds of ways in which we determinedly keep ourselves sometimes fixed to things that are less real, knowing full well that they aren't, knowing full well that they're less, knowing full well that they're abbreviated, and knowing full well that they inculcate the foolishness that we should ostensibly be trying to avoid, and yet we do it anyway. And I don't know how much that's accounted for in what's otherwise a very beautiful, like elegant formulation of that journey in Book 7 or in the Whole Republic. I don't know how much it accounts for that.
Isn't that in
But
the whole three different the tripartite soul? That's the soul that has the different. Isn't it somewhere in that?
yeah, maybe it is to some degree. Maybe it is. But I sometimes think it's more than just the strength of the appetitive. I think sometimes it's like, I think in that tripartite schema, you have the the higher faculty of reason that can chart its course wisely. And you, of course, have the appetitive, the stomach that just hungers and longs for indiscriminately. And then in between, you have the spiritedness that can ally itself with either. But what is it that determines that alliance? That's something like the will, which is, of course, so fraught. But what is it exactly? What kind of love is it that can move the needle of that spirit and ally itself properly? And it's still, I think that's a very hard question.
Proclus, when he talks about like what a self is, he uses Plato's idea of the tripart self, but he also kind of enriches it a little bit. And so they have the appetitive, the spirited. Each level shares kind of half a property with the level above and below. So the spirited has some appetite and some reason, and that's how they actually talk. So then there's the reasonable, and then he breaks up the reasonable, which is above the thumos or the spirit, into kind of two, which is I think is really cool. So there's the clever reason, and there's kind of I would call the divine reason. And so Odysseus might be a hero of the clever reason, where I would say like Proclus himself, maybe unironically, is a hero of the divine reason. So you have kind of the same tripartite soul, but it allows for, I would say, someone like to be a clever business person using their intelligence, but not their actual goodness. So it kind of combines goodness and intelligence a little bit and lets you split them up.
In book 7, Plato talks about the use of dialectic just to be a good salesman or a business merchant or whatever.
Right. That's Proclus's. Odysseus is virtuous, and he's very humble in a lot of ways and a good guy, but he's not as divine as like Socrates, like especially to the Greeks. Like if you all want all your sons to be like Odysseus or like Socrates, they have a different kind of like heroic reason that they use. And Odysseus's reason shoots arrows at bad people and tricks cyclopses and stuff like that. And Socrates's reason transforms bad people into lovers of the good. So they're similar in a lot of ways, but especially in the modern age, you could argue that like the modern age does a lot of Odysseus kind of courage, but not Socrates's or Jesus's or whatever kind of courage.
In the training of the guardians, he suggests that they need to be warriors and philosophers, not just philosophers. So I think
very
he's
Greek as well. The Muslim tradition, like if you look at Muhammad, he's like a warrior prophet. If you were to use almost like D&D terms to describe their character, because Jesus is not a warrior, and he's such an influence on the West. But Socrates and Muhammad are much more ready to like grab a spear and defend their city in a way that like, and Odysseus as well. Again, like I think it's part of being a hero other than Christ, the Buddha. Epictetus, I think, is a really good example. I don't think he ever fought in any wars or anything.
although Jesus does waffle on this one because he does say he comes with a sword and all that and turn children against their parents and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, metaphorically, he's the all, right? Yeah.
But talking of Jesus, Chris, were you hinting at agape, that's missing in Plato? Is that what you were hinting at?
Yeah, maybe. Or that there's something resolute that the Christian tradition picks up about the person who refuses the call sounded by the good, even when they become aware of it. And that there's a resolution to remain cloistered. There's a resolution to remain in the cave. There's a hostility almost, I think, to the invitation that's offered by what's more, what's more beautiful and what's fuller. And we have it in us to reject that out of hand. We have it in us to reject it because of the very thing that it is, spitefully, because of the very thing that it is. And I don't find that, like, that's an incredible, it's a puzzling part of our nature. And I don't find it as much in Plato.
But is it not maybe because of the painful nature of being dragged up?
Bye, Sevilla. You can just say bye. I think it's wonderful to see you today, even though you were probably the quietest of us five.
It was, Sevilla. Great to see
I
you.
kept
Yes.
cherishing your face. I would look up and I would go like, I'm so glad I know that person and she's in my presence right now. I just want to say that was happening. Oh, you're
Oh,
muted
you're on
as
mute.
well.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was a very sweet thing to say.
Yeah. You're a joy. We should catch up again sometime. Just throwing that out there.
And we still need to do the quality talk as well, or the
Oh yeah. Because you're back from your adventure that we probably could have talked about a lot too today. Yeah.
Okay, well, I will see you guys later.
Yeah, I think what you just said, Lizelle, I think it's a really good observation. It's like it demands something, demands something. It poses a responsibility and foists a demand on us. And
I think anyone who has been disillusioned knows how fucking painful that is.
Yeah. And something has to be done about it. There's this thing where it's like, I feel like when it happens, when you're shaken out of, when you're given a mirror, let's say, and you look into it and it just becomes clear, your predicament, like really painfully, searingly clear. It comes with an imperative, right? The revelation isn't a vacant revelation. It's a revelation that's pregnant with necessity. Okay. Now you know, therefore you must act. You must decide. You must choose. You must move.
I want to be like a little turtle in my shell, just
Yeah.
hide away forever. I just want all the bad things. I want to be a happy little Epicurean and taste good things and be safe inside the cosmic womb of God, my mother who protects me from all harm. I just want to feel good. And then you're telling me I have to be painfully. That's the beauty of the pain part. Because I read a German translation that Heidegger used of the cave, and he emphasizes the pain like only the Germans could. Like the like there's a passion to it. And it's like, I remember saying to my friends, Lizelle, like that it kind of, I was like, why do you have to emphasize that part so much? But it's in German they call it the Durchbruch. It's the breaking through. It's the fucking hammer breaking through the shell of the egg, and gold comes in with the shell breaking through as well. But like, yeah, it's painful. It's not a fun myth. A lot of like, you read the nativity scene, and it's like guys are showing up, and there's gifts coming, and the Lord is in Bethlehem, and it's awesome. And then Plato's myth is like, you're suffering to begin with, you're clamped down, you're full of nonsense, and the whole time you're being rescued, it's horrible and painful, and then the whole time you're returning, it's awkward. Yeah.
Because I was thinking about that earlier, Chris, when you mentioned like the eyes are the same. I think the line that maybe you were thinking of, he talks at a certain point like, it hurts just as much coming back. You're just as disorientated coming back to the dark than you are going to the light. So it's the same eyes. So it's a double hurt. It's painful to exit. It's painful to re-enter. It's not a fun. Well, maybe fun, but
no, that's exactly. It's not. And because something's also, there's something's lost, right? Something has irrevocably been broken. And you have to, in some sense, you have to consign to that rupture. You know what I mean? So you can't go back.
There's a line of the song coming to me. Something is lost, but something is found. And I think if the something is found, if you can see that or sense it in some way, you'll be willing to go through the pain. But if you can't sense or have an intuitive feeling of that something that might be found, there's no way you're going to do that. Why would you?
Pain is particularly tricky. I would wonder, Rick, if you've ever had really painful moments, because you're one of the happiest. Like, I would say you've had a nice, happy adult arc. You've landed at a pretty good place. Like, pain can destroy someone's life. It's really, there's a reason you feel pain and want to avoid it so naturally. And a lot of like humility is often the first step, like we've kind of been hinting at, is an encounter with like an embarrassing amount of like self-awareness or something. And yeah, it's
I'll have a funny answer and then a serious one. The funny one is if this hammer breaking through happens in the pub, then it will be fun. So that's a funny answer.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, and
I got
on that thought, I thought this game would be a great way for all of us philosophers whose families don't get it. We could play it with our families, and then maybe they get it. What a great idea. Okay, so the serious answer is I've had a lot of pain in my life. And I grew up in really difficult, like life in extremis. I grew up in really, really painful circumstances.
Yeah. You learned early, yeah, that's true.
And multiple levels of my life are multiple levels of trauma. And I only discovered this at a point when my life was the circumstances of my life were becoming so good that I was so fortunate that I was studying Gestalt psychotherapy, and I needed to be in counseling as part of the program, and just going through my childhood, things that come up when you're doing deep therapy. My therapist made me realize you have multiple PTSDs, multiple. So much so that my whole life growing up was just like, there was never a time when that wasn't the case, so that it was the norm for me.
Yeah, you were like hyper vigilant and just
almost
always
like in a war zone, you
I
know.
see, yeah.
Yeah. So I've had a lot of pain and trauma in my life.
And you've just dealt with it maturely, and
yeah, I don't know.
it's cool.
you live, you learn.
I just always think of you as like one of the happiest people. When I'm like, how should I be morally? I'm like, happy bus driver. That's who I should be, because I know Rick and he says you should be a happy bus driver, and you embody that as a person, that you're very cheerful to be around. And
I think having gone through pain can make you a happier person.
oh no, definitely, yeah. But it can halt you. That's Zach Stein
Many
talks
people
about.
are mangled by it. Many people are mangled by trauma and everything, and they become kind of crippled or broken.
That's why agape is so awesome, because if you can give people a little oasis of love for even a minute, sometimes that release of pressure allows like their creativity, their soul to kind of come back a little bit. The pain is so inhibiting for some people that agapic, just saying like, it's cool, we don't have to be in a hurry, even though this thing has been taking a while, or yeah, just caring about someone. We were talking about this in Chris, you might like this, in our fellowship group, just how nice little moments of caring are with strangers, like, oh,
Greg,
hi, you have a nice dress on.
Greg Enriquez made it sound so simple, but I think he said somewhere that, as a psychotherapist in clinical work, one of the most important things is just creating that space for a client.
It's magical, yeah.
Where you seeing them and giving them support and care and love in a way that, you try to see what's good and beautiful and true and whatnot in them, and them having that. That's, I think, the most important part of the process. Just that. And I think when I think back on when I was in therapy, and I did it as a student in the training, but I loved it so much that I kept doing it on and off, years of doing it, years of not doing when I could. There's just something about that space that you've got a person who's like a kind of expert and professional friend who cares about you. That's so healing. I mean, that's the bottom line, and they're insightful too. So they help you see things. They do what Chris said. They know how to show the mirror to you, and get you to see things about yourself that you might not otherwise see. Yeah, agape. Agape, as John says, makes people into people.
Yeah. And I have to think of attention again. I think it's Jonathan Peugeot, right, that talks of love as attention, and how desperately people need to be seen, to just be paid some attention. It's actually sad how desperately people need to be seen.
Recognition, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're social beings. We're social beings. We're dialogical beings. We need to be seen by others.
That's why people go to such extremes for their identity once they start getting rewarded for it. It's so interesting to think about how like really bad behavior, once like if you're really desperate internally and then someone recognizes you for some bad behavior, you can turn that into a whole identity and just be this horrible person because we need to be loved, because we really need to be seen, and we'll do anything to be seen. Yeah, it's
Your internet trolls. That's what's going on with them.
right. Yeah.
It's exactly what it is. They managed to figure out a way of getting attention, and they otherwise weren't getting it. It's an easy route to be a kind of attention vampire or something like that, you know.
And it's difficult to know the kind of attention that you actually want or need, you know. I mean, it's all well and good to have agape available to you, but then the trick is, well, can you take it? Can you accept it? Can you receive it? That's I think the great challenge, just as much as finding it is opening to it, right? That's the great canonical challenge, at least. And much like allowing your eyes to adjust, I think that was a good comparison, Lizelle, to the light. It's painful to behold and to be beheld by it, and to think of it as something you just sort of passively receive effortlessly, I think is definitely not the right way to think about it. It's something that whose receipt requires its own kind of effort, right? Which I think gets harder and harder, I don't know, as time goes on. Or maybe that's just me.
It's hard to generalize about these things.
I forget the Stoic, but he was like 82 and he tripped, and that demonstrated to him and everyone that he was not being mindful after he had learned mindfulness, like you're talking about, Chris, mindfulness towards the good. And he tripped and he said, "I'm just not getting up. I'm done." And he was like 82 and just kind of died of old age or whatever.
Is this an ancient Stoic?
Yeah, I forget the name off the top of the head, but yeah, it's like one of the big Stoic names. Yeah, he's just
Sure.
I
like,
totally feel him. I have had experiences like that when you fall, like, I'm just not getting up. I'm just gonna lie here.
Totally.
but that was after being like a Zen master for like 50 years. That's why he said that. That was like his attentiveness was so keen to the good. That's why I love what Christopher, what you're saying, like metanoia is it's minimized, I would say, in Plato. It's not as emphasized as it is in other. I love Tanabe's book on metanoetics because there's that move of saying, despite my reason, despite all of our reason, it's not enough, and just falling on your sword and being open to possibility in a new way, in a non-egoic way. There's you can't generate, like, some people can say like, oh no, our intuition can generate that, but you just can't. I don't think there's something that metanoetic leap of faith that if you try to only have self-power, it really you are kind of bottlenecked. And then again, as soon as you get pride of your self-power, right, that like limits your capacity to be metanoetic. So it is like the Greeks in general, I think, do a wonderful job on the virtue of hubris, or virtue of humility and the vice of hubris. But Plato kind of glorifies Socrates in such a, he only knew him for a couple of years, so he probably thought he was so beautiful that he couldn't make him as humble as he actually was. And I think the image of Socrates is a little bit the way you're saying, distorted in a way. Even what's the guy that writes the Anabasis? Rick?
Who writes what?
The Anabasis, the Greek, is another one of Socrates' students. I'm forgetting his name right now.
I'm not sure.
But anyways, yeah, like I think that point is so important, the metanoetic point of like, but then you have Christ, who's right down the road in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. You know, you go to Athens, they're right next to each other. I think if you take the region as a whole and just have many sages.
What I find, what makes accepting agape possible for me without Christ is being in relationship with like my sisters. Like we both give and receive agape to each other at certain points. So it's not just a receiving. Then you don't feel so, I don't know, so reluctant, because receiving is the hardest part. It's much easier giving than receiving.
Yeah.
But if you also have the opportunity to give, then receiving slowly becomes more acceptable. Because Christ is not an option for everyone.
Well, and Plato would say the later is more virtuous than just the giving, because even I think in Schindler, like they talk about just being the recipient of the good or having a practical component to it as well. The both and is better than the pure agape in some sense. Because it combines the return and the ascent, ironically, and the giving back. Because if you think about a family or a system or anything made of higher order, anything made of parts that is a coherent whole, if the whole is loving the parts, it's awesome to be the part. And if the parts are loving the whole, it's really good for the whole. So you want both elements to be happening. And so if the whole is just loving the part, that's great. But I think you kind of want the reciprocity, because really the whole is just the parts. It's the whole is this weird illusion that if none of the parts are the whole is gone. So, you know, there's zero presence of Christ when there's no Christians practicing Christianity, or neither Platonists, right? So we have to not forget, we won't get too Christian, like the spirit of Plato lives when people read the Republic.
Or play Plato in the pub.
Or drink and talk about the good.
I will probably have to go because it's past my bedtime, and I'm going to lie awake for like at least 3 hours thinking about this conversation. So it was lovely seeing you all. Chris, I'm so glad that you joined us again.
Yeah. Nice to have you here, Chris.
Me too. Thank you. And I'll endeavor to continue to join you until the end of the book. Truly.
Yeah, we haven't actually set a new date, which we usually do.
Yeah, I'll email everyone about that. Since Sevilla, I didn't want to hold her. I'll just send a quick email.
Yeah.
All right.
Great to see you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, it's great to see you into the darkness. I always love when my European friends, it becomes dark.
I'm not lying about my time.
I'm gonna have to pop off too, gents. It was great to see both of you. I'll be in touch with both of you.
Yeah, good to see you, Chris.
Lots to talk to both of you about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Look forward to it. Take care.
Okay.
See you, Rick. Bye, Chris.
Bye.
All right, Robert.
Yeah, we should probably go as well. So fun to talk about the good.
Yeah, I have 9 million thoughts swimming around in my head right now.
I was so lucky, Rick, that last year, like a year and a half ago now, I just every weekend almost, me and like Daniel Zaruba, who you met, and like 4 or 5 other people, we just met and we read like half a dialogue and we did fellowship and meditated and circled and all this stuff. And so I find this so fun. It's like I don't know, it feels like a hobby, I think, because we're so practically focused or whatever, but it's the best use of time to talk about Plato. And especially, I love this. Like, you guys are all over the world, and getting to hang out and see everybody is, such a cool.
You know, one thought before I go, when you mentioned the parts loving the whole and vice versa.
Oh
One of
yeah,
this, even on a very simple level, like the ecology of practices, I think one of the things that it encourages is for, like, just say embodiment, just take embodiment. That's a part of you, your body.
right. It has to all be real.
Body has all the different parts in it. So when you do these practices that make you sensitized to your embodiment,
yeah,
you're loving that part of you because you're
exactly.
suddenly relating towards your own body in an agapic way, you know,
You're
warm.
remembering, right? You're
Yeah,
like,
you're being caring and
yeah.
re-embodying, and there's a kind of care. You know, mindfulness and carefulness are very similar words. So
Oh,
I forget
100%. Yeah.
who said this. Somebody said, like, the trains used to say, be careful of the gap. Now they say, be mindful of the gap. You know, when you step off a train, the space
I
between
do that. I try to mix the words when I'm with students because it's hard to
Yeah.
explain attention to people. You have to use a lot of examples and tricks and stuff. But yeah, definitely.
So careful is full of care. So when you're full of care, you're mindful. But when you're mindful, you should be full of care. So there's an agapic element in awareness.
Oh yeah, like, well, the old times, like the ancients believed in the evil eye and the I remember I was in a
The
class.
ancients, Robert. I'm Italian, and my partner is
Or
Greek.
yeah,
I
exactly.
still believe in the evil
Right.
eye.
Well, but I think I give it credit though. I think if you, because I was going to say the opposite is true. I was giving a speech in a speaking class when I was like 20, and I remember being so nervous and like my thoughts were running. And there was this woman who was like 40 or 50 in the second row who I had talked to, and she just smiled at me in a calm, confident, reassuring way. And then I just was like normal again. And like you can definitely like look at someone in a way, you'll get in their head immediately, even almost unconsciously. Women will touch their hair, and
Yeah.
so we've lost that because in the kind of top down like willful model, good intent and the gaze and stuff like that become very secondary to your thoughts and your schemas and your plans and stuff like that. But yeah, I think um even when, I'm sure like you would probably agree with this, when someone's been meditating a lot and doing guided meditations and they're like Buddhist and they're full of love, and then they guide you through a meditation, you could feel their attitude and their intent and the way their attention is in the words and then in the state that you kind of get into or whatever. And it's not like they take over your soul or something, but it's transjective, it's participatory. And yeah, I think I've learned all this stuff through Plato, because when you start to shift from a non-dialogic to a dialogic view of the world and realize that like my childhood was in participation, my relationship is in participation, my relationship to my mind is active and participatory, then when I'm investing 2 hours in yoga, that's gonna like kind of, I like the psychological bleed where it just kind of like not consciously but kind of happens through almost osmosis. Oh yeah, when I feel good physically, my attention is better, my ability to feel calm is better, everything else takes care of itself. Like we practice karma yoga, but he never talks about it because he's just like my instructor or whatever, my Japanese yoga teacher. He's like, if everything else is good, just be nice. That's the last bit of good karma as far as others are concerned. So yeah, I think that paying into yourself and getting it back. Yeah.
Loving the parts of yourself. And the more you love
Yeah, the parts idea. Yeah.
the more the parts love the whole, in a way.
Yeah, because if you think of it as like a group, if the whole group is happy, then who's not happy, right? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but there's this top down, like from whole to part and part to whole. You're really onto something there. It's just like,
Oh
even
yeah,
like
I
even
say
when,
that
like,
casually, but I think about this stuff all the time. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, but even like when John does this thing with this symbol.
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, the H. Yeah, because we're always gestalting together. We're not, people confuse it as just the part or just the whole, but it's, you need both. That's what's so weird about the Parmenides, because to be and not be, and to be related to not being, to becoming and to being from not being and being, that's what's so weird about it all. And Yeah.
and what the one is in the Parmenides. Oh God, that's what we were talking about. Units, the unit, the one, and then
Well,
the
yeah, and
one.
especially if the one, is it counting or not, and is it, yeah, if you start to go like what is or is not the one. Um, yeah. And then again, like Chris was saying, even if you don't remember a fact that you learned, the act of doing that to the cognitive agent that we are is so good. Like